Thank you very much for joining. And yeah, it's just a little bit past the hour, so I'll go ahead and start the webinar. So my presentation today is about our new and improved Landscape Alternatives mobile app. I kind of put new and improved in scare quotes there. You know, people often say, well, it's kind of an oxymoron, right? Something can't be both new and improved. But in this case, I think it fits because as you'll see, we added a lot of new content to the app, but we also improved what was there to start with as well. And I'll be talking about all of that. The project, I guess I'm presenting today both as my normal role as the coordinator of the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, but also on behalf of the Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes Collaborative, which is kind of a project of MIPIN's, separately funded, but we did a lot of the new work, the content addition under the Wiggle banner. All right. So just a quick outline for the presentation. I'll walk you through essentially the problem or problems that the app was designed to address. We'll talk a little bit about its original development a few years ago, particularly looking at some of what I'll call the imperfections with the app that we wanted to fix for this time around. Look at the goals for the revisions and additions, and then I'll actually demo the new version of the app, both on iOS and Android, and kind of highlight what the differences are and what is kind of special and working really well about each one. So the problem it kind of starts with introduction, right? So many invasive plants were originally introduced as ornamentals. And the extent to which they were introduced ornamentally differs among different plant types. Now, I'm hoping to walk you through what this graphic below is kind of complex, and it was done by one of our board members, Teresa Cully, is a biology professor at University of Cincinnati, and she and some of her students put this graphic together. And it essentially shows by different plant type, woody vines, I guess the vines are both woody vines and herbaceous vines, and then non-viney forbs, how the plant was originally introduced. And that's what's at the bottom is mode of introduction. I know this text is teeny tiny, but these left bars here, here, and here is intentional introduction. The middle one, when there is one, so here, here, and here is accidental, and then the rightmost here, none for vines, and here is unknown. So the plant is here, but we just cannot figure out how it got here. And what you see is that for woody taxa, the vast majority were introduced on purpose, and for those purposes, in 89% of cases, it was as an ornamental plant. The other little part you see with woodies, about 5% were introduced to control erosion or for reclamation purposes. With vines, there's still a pretty high percentage, so about 65% of all vine species that were introduced were done so for ornamental use. There you see this little block here representing about 5% was for medicinal herb, like as a medicinal herb or culinary use. Maybe kudzu is one of the most classic examples there of certainly a very invasive vine, but it's quite important in Chinese herbal medicine. So that has contributed to its introduction and continued use in some cases. And then with the vines, though, we have a higher proportion here that were accidentally introduced. And then with the forbs, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. This is a much lower percentage, 31% of forbs and grasses used for introduced specifically for the ornamental trade. We see this medicinal and culinary being a bigger role, a fodder for cattle or other wildlife. And then I want to highlight too, a decent chunk, almost 10%, introduced for the aquarium trade. That's so when we're looking at our revisions, as you'll see, we focus a lot on woodies through the wiggle work, but we also added a lot of aquatics for aquarium use, but also water gardens, which are really taking off. In COVID times, like 5 of my neighbors have installed like some sort of water feature in their yard. It's crazy. But with the forbs and grasses, you also see a lot more accidental introduction. So cool graphic there by one of our board members. Of course, it's not so much how the plant was introduced as how it's being used now. A lot of these introductions happened hundreds of years ago. But the problem remains that invasive plants are still in trade. There's actually a very recent paper by a team out of University of Massachusetts Amherst that looked at this. The full citation is down here. And they found that, so they compiled a master list of plants that are regulated as invasive by some jurisdiction in the United States. And they compiled a list of 1,285 plant species. And they found that 61% of those are being sold by some vendor somewhere in the US. And they identified 1,330 specific vendors selling one or more of these species. So that's not great. They do in their discussion in their paper dig into a little bit more nuance. Some of their findings included that the states that have pretty tough regulations about selling invasive or high potential invasive plants, like Wisconsin in our region is one, and Minnesota too. They both have very kind of precautionary approaches in their regulations. They're pretty good about preventing those species from being grown and sold in state borders, but less good in their ability to regulate across state lines and stop people either going out of the state, buying a plant and bringing it back, or internet sales is the other huge part of that. Another one of our board members has called like internet trade of plants basically the Wild West. Like it's not regulated and it's very hard to regulate. I guess the low-hanging fruit there are commercial nurseries that, they're used to regulatory interaction and inspection, and to some extent, I think there's a high willingness among professional nurseries to address invasive plant issues. The real Wild West are these third-party retailers like Amazon, eBay, Etsy. You can buy absolutely anything. You could buy garlic mustard seeds. You could buy common blackthorn seeds, tree of heaven, like the worst invasive plants you can think of. You can probably buy them, including even federally regulated noxious weeds on some of these internet sources. So we've got plants still in trade. And then ones that aren't commonly sold anymore, especially, again, by these professional nurseries, you're really not going to find them selling common buckthorn anymore. But you will still absolutely find it on the landscape, either as a legacy planting, especially with long-lived shrubs and trees. Someone might have planted something 50 years ago and it's still on the landscape today. Or sometimes it's not a plant that anyone planted, but it's popped up in people's yards and on people's property as a volunteer. Often it's birds or wildlife, or even wind or gravity from next door spreading these plants, and it starts growing and people just think, hey, I don't mind that. It's serving a purpose in my yard, so they keep it. So there's kind of two prongs here, right? Among people that don't spend their whole days thinking about plants or invasive plants. There's sometimes a bit of an awareness challenge where people have invasive plants in the yard, but they have no idea because they may not even have a concept of what an invasive plant is. To some degree, it's sometimes termed as plant blindness, but it basically means that people like plants and they think as long as it's green and healthy looking, it's good. So that's one aspect of it. The other one being that people don't necessarily realize that you can go and buy an invasive plant at the store. Surely if it's bad for us, it's not for sale, right? Or if it's harmful for the environment, it's not, people can't just go out and buy it, right? Well, it's not that not that simple. As most folks in this field know. And then there's a knowledge gap. Once you kind of address the awareness and people realize that they may have invasive plants in their yard, or that they may encounter things that are invasive at a nursery or a big box store or online, certainly. They may not have the knowledge that they wish they had about how to obtain desired garden outcomes with non-harmful plants. So that's the other part. They may have certain aesthetics in mind. They want a certain form or shape. They enjoy a certain plant color or bloom time. Usually it's the flowers have the nice color, could be the leaves. They want fragrance, maybe a fragrance garden, and they want healthy plants that aren't prone to a lot of insect damage, diseases, not like non-fatal, just aesthetic concerns like powdery mildew that can make your plants look ugly. They want them, and that's a maintenance issue. A lot of times they're looking for things that are low maintenance. They don't have to spray them with insecticide or fungicide to keep them looking pretty. Function, a lot of times, especially with the woodies, people are looking for some privacy screening to, in high density situations, establish a physical barrier between them and their neighbor's property. They may be looking for ground cover, just a large, expansive yard that they don't know what to do with, but they don't want to mow it, so they want to grow a ground cover. Or a physical barrier, like maybe a low hedge that's still going to stop people from walking across your lawn, if that's a concern. There's all sorts of different functions people might be looking for. And then birds and wildlife. As much as we might like to think that our native wildlife only eat native plants, that's not true. A lot of them are very generalist and will readily enjoy fruits or other parts of invasive plants, and people notice. So if they're going to replace it, they might want something that's equally attractive to birds or wildlife. And obviously views differ. Some people view, chipmunks and birds as undesirable. They don't want them. Icky. So our vision with all of this was to develop a free mobile app, kind of a pocket guide, that matches invasive ornamental plants with non-invasive alternatives. And at least we built the kind of philosophy and vision out a little bit since it originated, but as far as I can tell at the outset, the real goal was to match invasives to alternatives by what we perceive to be the desired traits, like the reason people are putting these on their landscape or keeping them there if they kind of pop up by themselves. The original app, I think the idea for it was developed by Mippen, and the technical ability to write the content and find the pictures came from Mippen. This is before my time, but for quite a long time, Mippen has had pretty strong ties with the green and horticultural industry. We started a working group called the Invasive Plants and Trade Working Group quite a while ago, with just the idea in mind that as any kind of issue stakeholder does, green industry folks react better when you have the conversations with them early and often, and before you try and come in with the really restrictive regulations. Certainly, Mippen's not a regulatory agency, but we work with regulators as well. So we've really put a priority on building those relationships, and it helped us kind of gain the knowledge and input necessary to develop good horticultural alternatives. And And then on the technical side, to develop the app, we worked with the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health, sometimes also called Bugwood, at University of Georgia. These are the same team behind EdMaps and has several other popular apps. So we knew they could do that part. And then we got funding through the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation. That's actually a Chicago area specific foundation. It was probably a little bit of a shot in the dark to ask them to develop something for a regional organization that would benefit the whole region, but they did, and that's awesome. So, Landscape Alternatives version 1 was released in 2012 for Apple devices first, and then the Android version came 1 year later, 2013. I should update this. At this point, it's had over 15,000 downloads. The vast majority of them have been on iOS. Android, I guess, it came a little later and just wasn't as popular, but so I would say it's been pretty successful. The TechLine News is kind of a news source and technical resource on invasive plant management. They did a poll about use of mobile apps for invasive plant purposes, and Landscape Alternatives came in number 4 of in app use among people east of the Mississippi. So, which makes perfect sense because it was written from a Western perspective, and it's really not going to be too helpful in California. But so we were proud of that. But at the same time, despite some success and recognition, we do recognize there were some imperfections with the old app. So there were a few just flat out mistakes. The one I can think of most off the top of my head is that for whatever reason, really just an error. Someone typed an HTML tag wrong. Redbud, the tree, understory tree, was being recommended as an alternative for miscanthus, which is an ornamental grass. So, whoops, it happens. But it just kind of lingered for a while. An issue that some people groused about was the large file size. And the reason for this is that all the photos in the app were and still are in the new version native to the app, meaning they are the actual photo files are inside the app. It's not that the app goes out and uses your data to show the pictures on the internet. That would be the other way to do it, but the Bugwood folks had a really strong preference for keeping the photos inside the app. It makes maintenance a lot easier, and it also means that the app is usable offline if you don't have a data signal. So you could take your iPad, with you to the nursery and use the app even without connecting to their Wi-Fi. So that's another advantage there. But at the same time, looking through it, there were some just bad photos. So this photo with the black background here, this is a close-up image of the flower of a rosemary willow, which is a non-native horticultural or ornamental willow tree. And this isn't a bad photo in itself, but this was the only picture for that species, and it gives you no idea what the actual plant would look like in your garden. So if our goal is, suggesting people plant these as alternatives, I don't think that picture is really doing us any favors. And this picture was from, you can maybe tell by the little number code down here if you use them at all, but this is from, Bugwood Images database. It's a picture we could easily get for free. So that's probably why it got used. This one on the right is a native relative of Russian and autumn olive. Can't remember the common name off the top of my head. Is Iliagnus commutata, which I think is silver buffalo berry. It's a fine plant, but this picture does not make me want to plant it. It looks like half dead. I don't know what the heck this is behind it. It just looks like mud. Just kind of an ugly picture. And this one came from the USDA plants database. So again, it was just a matter of, being able to find that picture and use it without paying license fees easily. And then redundancy came in when, these 3 photos are just 3 examples, the very prominent and identifiable flowers of James Rocket. None of them are bad pictures, but they don't necessarily, I think one of them would do, right? Instead of using all 3 and taking up that file space. And then there was quite a lot of inconsistency between species. When we had a species in the app where we had a lot of good photos, it was like they used them all. So there might be like 12 photos. And then for species like these 2, the Iliagnus here, the native Iliagnus and the rosemary willow, these were the only photos in the original app for these species. So it's like, ugh, that's not great. So that was something we wanted to address. In my opinion, too, the app used a little bit too broad of a view of nativity. So it was kind of looking at it from the whole country scale. So if something is listed as native alternative, all it meant is that it's native somewhere in the US. And the issue there, especially with the revision, is we actually end up having an invasive species that is native to part of North America, but is considered invasive in the Midwest. So we wanted to provide a little bit more detail there. So if we're saying something is native, where's the native to? There were some nitpicky formatting inconsistencies. So when I actually went into the code for the app, you could kind of tell that either different people had worked on different parts of it, or different people, or the same person worked on it at radically different times, because there were just differences that drove me a little crazy. But I say it's nitpicky, but it did impact the overall look and professionalism of the app. And then finally, there were a few not so great alternatives, as it turned out. We didn't recommend using anything invasive because that would be nuts. But we did have a few species that were maybe known to escape from cultivation. They're not on anyone's invasive species list in the Midwest, but they have been noted popping up here and there. Let's just put it that way. So there are some in that category. There were some that you just can't find anywhere in a nursery ever, or they're not really considered horticultural plants at all. There were only a couple of those. And then the last one we would maybe encounter is something that's very either disease prone or pest prone. There was one that our team on the woody side described as deer candy. Like basically, if you have deer at all, they're going to mow this thing down at all stages of growth. So the only way to grow it is with complete exclosure for the plant's entire life. So they recommended we took that one out, and we did. So kind of putting this into goals for our update here. We want to add the water garden species. The actual writing and development for that was done quite a few years ago, not by myself, but by the Wisconsin First Detectors Network, or WIFDN. Ann Pierce, if you guys know her, is the coordinator there and did all that work. We also want to add more woody taxa. It took quite a long time to do this. We started in fall of 2018 and finished late in 2020, essentially, actually doing all the writing. And this was done under the Wiggle Collaborative, which it was funded through an EPA grant on behalf of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. So I want to recognize them as well for the help. And address those imperfections while we're at it, right? If we're going into the app to add content, it seems like we should probably also fix issues. To try and improve the aesthetics a little bit, keeping in mind we did not have funding to completely overhaul the app architecture. It's still a nonprofit grant-funded project. It's not going to look like something that came out of Silicon Valley. It's just not, and I'm okay with that. Want to certainly kick out any poor alternatives. We used new photo sources. So as folks that know MIPIN well may know, we are now co-located at the Morton Arboretum. They're our fiscal sponsor, so that gave me access to the Morton Arboretum's internal photo library. which was pretty great. And I used that a lot. I've also, through some other project work with Pippin, established contacts at Missouri Botanical Gardens, and was able to get permission to use a lot of their photos. Absolutely fantastic. And then a third really important source actually ended up being Flickr. Flickr is, an image repository that anyone can use. And when you upload your pictures there, you set your, you have to put in your licensing settings. So we were limited to pictures that folks have said you can use for non-commercial purposes, but it turns out there's a lot of great ones. So that really helped us out too. And finally, another goal was to better promote the use of native taxa. And I'll get into that a little bit. So for this part, I'm really talking about the work we did with Wiggle. I'm not sure exactly what process Wifton and Anne went through to do their alternatives, but for the Wiggle part, we basically convened a landscape alternatives committee with good representation from public gardens and arboreta, Morton Arboretum obviously, but also others from the region, to commercial nurseries, landscape architects, this is kind of the private sector here, university extension, mostly not the weed science or the invasive species folks, but the horticulture extension folks from university extensions. Invasive species professionals, so other groups similar to MIPIN, our peers, and then conservation professionals. So, they often have invasive species on their radar, but we were lucky to have participation from folks from the Nature Conservancy, an organization that has a broader conservation goal. And that's really where a lot of our good native plant knowledge kind of merged with the horticultural side. So, and the full, the names of the people that were in that subcommittee are all on the Wiggle website if you are curious. So I thought it was important as part of the process to kind of write out our philosophy for developing the alternatives. I don't think it's radically different than when the app was originally made, but it just never was written down. So we kind of documented it this time. So we decided our any non-natives that we recommend as alternatives, obviously they can't be invasive, but they also shouldn't be known to escape from cultivation in any place that has a similar climate to the Midwest. And the other thing too is the use of this app, although it is a Midwestern app, isn't necessarily limited to the Midwest. It's out there on the Apple Store. So folks in New York, New Jersey, Maine, anyone could download this and I think could probably benefit and learn from it. So yeah, we took a more restrictive view. It's a lower threshold than invasiveness. I'll tell you a few of the species we kicked out of the original app, again, focusing on woodies. We had Japanese maple, Acer palmatum in there. It's not listed by any Pippin state as invasive, but it's showing up in New Jersey and the Mid-Atlantic as an invasive problem there. So that one was definitely gone. We ended up taking out Cornus moss. That's called cornelian cherry. It's a type of dogwood. Again, that's not on anyone's invasive plant list, but we've seen at public gardens where it's being grown in mass quantities that it is self-seeding around, and even into non-cultivated areas, so into wooded areas. So that's not great. So there's 2 records for it on AdMaps, and one of them is mine. Anyway, that one out. And then a third is Japanese tree lilac. One of my colleagues at the Arboretum, a much more knowledgeable plant person than me, thinks that has the potential to be the next calorie pear. So there's no way we should be recommending it, right? So yeah, gone. We thought it was important that the alternatives need to obviously share at least one desirable horticultural feature with the paired invasive plant, but we want to take a nuanced view and not try and present plants as exact equivalents to each other. Horticulturists get pretty sensitive about this. They're like, well, you can't just say, oh, it's green, it's got purple leaves, it's the same. You have to present a fair view. The alternatives, I kind of mentioned this with the deer candy plant, but they shouldn't be notoriously hard to grow because people just get discouraged. If you recommend them something and then it dies immediately or just like is a real pain to manage over the years, that's not great. They have to be commercially available because people are also going to get frustrated if you're recommending stuff that can't be found. We decided that via specialty nurseries is okay. We also decided that recommending cultivars is okay. However, we wanted to be clear to differentiate between cases where we're suggesting a cultivar because it's readily available and looks pretty, and cases where we're only recommending the cultivar. And there are pretty few of those, but they do happen. Like there are times when a cultivar is the only variety of a plant that's disease resistant. Like you really wouldn't recommend anymore just seed grown American elm because it's not Dutch elm disease resistant. However, there are cultivars that are. So that's one example. Another comes in with hardiness. So we recommend Kentucky wisteria as an alternative to Asian invasive wisterias, but there's only one cultivar that's hardy in zone 5 and colder. So that's important information for a Midwestern app, right? Where space is limited, not so much in the app, but in the accompanying brochure, we wanted to use that space to highlight natives first and foremost. And then I had to keep in mind too, this was more of a learning for me, but we can't be everything to everyone. We can't literally provide a textbook and an app. It's really intended to just give the audience a jumping off point to do more research and decide what plant is the right plant to put in their specific place and what level of care can they manage. So can't be everything to everyone. So the results of the new app version. We ended up adding 20 invasive plant species. Again, these were either woody or aquatic, but it represents a 70% increase. We've gone from 28 invasives to 48. We ended up actually with a net change of -1 non-native alternatives. I mentioned before there were several we took out. We did add some back, add different ones in, but yeah, a net change of -1. With the natives, we had a net change of adding 38. So all in all, we've got 48 invasives, 29 non-natives, 119 native plants, for a grand total of 196 total species profiles. We also, with the photos, I mentioned we wanted to revise not just the new content, but also address issues with the old content. So we redid the entire photo library for the entire app. I can't tell you how many photos we took out, but it was a lot. The net change, though, was an addition of 327 photos for a grand total of 974 photos that live in that app. It averages out to 5 photos per species, and it is pretty consistent. I think every species more or less in there has somewhere between 4 and 6 photos. We don't have any anymore with 1, and we don't have any anymore with like 12. So, and then after we had the results, conceptually, we had to actually put it into HTML code. This is what a plant profile in code looks like. It's all crazy HTML tags, weird Unicode stuff in here. They're like, this is a Unicode thing. I had to basically learn how to interpret and add to this 196 times, one for each species. It was rough. So much code, so much botany. I'm trying to do 58 things at the same time. All those pictures, oh my goodness, it just took a long time. But finally, here we are today. I should say too, just back up 1 second. I did have help with, I'm going to see if I go back to my old slide. There we go. I did have help. I enlisted an intern at UW to help me write the new content. So I gave her an HTML template and had her fill it in with new content for the new species. But I kind of was the editor in this process. So I did some writing too, because I mentioned before, we added the native range to all the native species. So even the old stuff, I had to go back in there and add that. And then I edited it to fix all the formatting stuff that was driving me nuts in the old app. And yeah, it took so long. but here we are, finally in 2021. I transferred the app code to University of Georgia in April at long last. They pretty quickly turned it around and gave me a beta version for Android. I'm primarily an Android user, and it's easier to code in Android than Apple. So they were happy to do that one first. They gave it to me in May. Then there was some turnaround because we had to fix all my coding mistakes. So it's hard to find a mistake in written code, but when you see it come to life in the app, suddenly you're like, oh, this whole thing is bolded and indented in crazy ways, and I need to go in and fix that. So there was a lot of that. Spelling too. Once you have HTML code written out like that, the spell check does not work, and it turns out I can't spell. So, but we edited, caught it, revised the code, and then they implemented the improved code in iOS in early July, tweaked a few issues that came up here and there. We fixed the font, like it had this old, like it was basically in Times New Roman, so we had to give it a new font to make it look a little nicer. And finally, the official launch of version 2 happened in August. If you would like to download it, if you haven't yet, you just search Landscape Alternatives in your app store. You can probably also search Bugwood apps, but don't search for Miffin, unfortunately, because it won't come up. You'll know you have the right one if you see our beautiful red bud flower here. This is the new app icon. And if this is your icon on your phone or smart device, it means it's been updated. So you've got the new one. So, let's actually take a look at the app. I'm going to run through essentially a short demo of the app. I'll do iOS first, but you will have to forgive me. I have used an iPad for less than 2 hours in my entire life, so I might kind of mess up. But I do have one here and I'm ready to do it. And then I'll show you on Android. So I think I need to give me 2 seconds to transition here. Stop that. Oop. And share on here. I'm actually gonna stop my video too, so you don't have to watch me like staring at this iPad. But we are go with this. Okay. And there's a little delay too. All right. So the one thing actually right off the bat that's different on the iOS version than the Android version is that this picture, which is actually the cover of our old brochure, is kind of like is always present. You always see this in the background. But it says swipe from the left to find your navigation. So I'm going to do that. Oops. And actually, I should have reset this from when I was playing it with it before. But when you first open the app, this is what you get. When you open the menu is a list of invasive plants that you may want to seek an alternative for. Is it alphabetic? Well, first it's grouped by type. So we've got the woodies first. Just because I spent so much time on them, I had to put them at the top. Then forbs, of which we don't actually have that many, and then the aquatics. So it's grouped there, and then in each group is alphabetic by common name. So let's jump in and look at one. I'm going to do burning bush. When I bought my house, I had 3 burning bush that I had to deal with. So let's say I am just learning somehow right now that burning bush is invasive. These tiles are all clickable and they take you through to the profile. I guess first you'll notice the invasive species itself shows up at the top, and then native alternatives are next. For folks that used version 1.0, you'll remember actually we had the exotics first for whatever reason, and natives were at the bottom. Well, we flipped it. We do have non-invasive but exotic alternatives recommended here, but they're way at the bottom. All right, so let's say I want to learn more about burning bush. I'm going to click on that tile, and it brings up the profile in the background. You do have to tap on it to get rid of the menu again. But one thing I really like about the iOS version is that the color coding carries over. You see this has like a pink background that carries over from that red tag. So if you somehow forget, that can just visually cue you that you're looking at the profile of one of the invasive plants. It's not too much changed from how these looked in the old app, but we did move the invasive threat up to closer to the top. So we talk about, what other names might you see. We did include some of the more common cultivars too, so that if someone sees this in the nursery, it's called fireball burning bush or compact burning bush compactus, they would be able to know that this is still invasive. This is still what we're talking about. Some of the landscape history and how it's used. This says it is still popular in landscaping choice despite its invasiveness, which I think is true. And then we talk about, however, it's invasive. These are what it's doing on the landscape and why we care about it. And then ID features, essentially. And then images are tabbed at the bottom. So if I want to just double check that something I have in my yard is burning bush, I can just toggle there and bring up my photos. We tried to include like both, what this might look like on the landscape and then close-ups. So that's obviously, this is burning bush in a garden setting. Then you just swipe to see the rest. This is burning bush being invasive. It's true. A close-up of those, fantastic red leaves that people know it for. The winged stems, also major ID feature. Leaves during the growing season, flowers, fruit. Sometimes we have bark for some of the woodies, not always though. Then that one's another quirky stem example. Just, yeah. Click back to the info. And this, if I click the back button at the top here, again, I'm used to having a back button actually on my phone, but iOS, it takes you back to the home screen, but you can just open up the menu again to get back to the same menu you were at before. Okay, and then the alternatives work very much the same way. Let's just look at black chokeberry. Again, that nice color code brought over the green. And for, excuse me, it's going to tell you any other names you might see. There are a few synonyms here. And then we added cultivar information. So this is a new section from the old app. We wanted to make sure, if we were naming cultivars of tall, we wanted to name cultivars that are appropriate for a northern climate. So Iroquois Beauty, Autumn Magic, and Vikings are some example. You might expect them to have maybe brighter fall color and reliable fruit production, but this certainly is not a case where only one of these cultivars would be appropriate. If you find, maybe at a native plant sale, seed grown black chokeberry, that's a perfectly good choice. And I'll show you kind of where we address that in the app itself in a moment. Talk about the landscape uses and then description. And then, I mentioned native range. That's always in the same place near the bottom of these profiles. Is native to the eastern half of the US and Canada, but not to the deep south. It's kind of awkward. It would have been nice to show a map of that, but just wasn't going to happen for 196 species. The growing zone is very important. You need to know where to grow it. And then some very basic cultivation information. Images, again, we want to show this in cultivation where we can. So here's a hedge. This is actually at the Arboretum in their hedge demonstration plots of black chokeberry. There's it's slightly bigger close up of the leaves, fall foliage. That is just as bright as the burning bush, and I won't hear otherwise. It has much prettier flowers than burning bush, and the fruits good for your bird friends. Okay. The last thing I want to show too, so this is a little bit different than the navigation on the Android version. There's a button here that's down at the bottom beneath whatever menu you're on that says A to Z alphabetical. Whenever you press that, that brings up every species in the entire app alphabetically by common name. And you just kind of need to use the tile color to know whether it's green, native, blue, exotic but not invasive, or red, invasive. That's just another way to use the app. And then we'll go to the more, this is just where you can find about the app, some of that context I mentioned here. It just is about, this is just general information about the app, but I did put down here the note on natives. Like, this is basically why we're really trying to lean into native recommendations. I do point out, not all of the natives are actually historically native to the Midwest or Northeast. Where we use them from outside of this region, we tried to go towards slightly more southern climates. So these are going to be your climate adaptable alternative species. But if you're really, if you're really concerned about having only historic natives to your area, you're going to have to ask someone that is into that where you are, or maybe use Bone App is a great resource for figuring some of that stuff out. And here's where we talk about cultivars. When we mention a cultivar, it's not because we want the trademark holder to make a bunch of money. That's not what we're about. We just know that is a cultivar that's available and that will grow well in this climate compared to others. And we talk down here about if you're really into native plants and you can find the straight species, that's usually perfectly fine and maybe better for pollinators and bugs and other critters. So that's where that lives. I think that's it for this one. I'm gonna stop. This is where I get all cumbersome here. Stop my share on that one. Now we're gonna hop onto Android. Whew. Okay, here's my phone. So the app looks fairly similar on Android. It just, like I said, it doesn't have that image of the home screen image behind it for whatever reason. And it doesn't have quite the same color coding, but there is something really cool about it that I would like to show you. Let's just take a peek at, heck, let's do Norway maple. Very similar. If I want to read more about the invasives, there it is. The one weird quirk about Android is, for whatever reason, the images and info are reversed. It's going to show you pictures first. There it is, a street tree. Here, this one has cultivars with the red leaves. I want to show that. Milky sap, good ID feature, flowers, etc. You have to toggle to find the information. like I said, all this is on a white background for whatever reason. It just didn't seem to work in Android. It talks about the cultivar names because, again, we want people to recognize that the cultivars belong to the invasive species and contribute. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Just want to leave time for questions is why I'm rushing a little bit. Again, we've got our native alternatives at top, non-natives below. What I wanted to show with the Android one is that we were able to, or we, Bugwood was able to program a better search feature for Android. So if you can freeform search in it, so if you press search, it brings up that list of everything that's in the app. And you can freeform search on more than just the species name. So it actually includes search terms for all the cultivar names. So let's say I am out there and I see hummingbird clethra, and I don't know what that is. So I'm gonna look it up and I just start typing and it brings up our profile for clethra or summer sweet. And you can go into the info, see cultivar. It actually talks about the differences in the cultivars down here. So that's that is pretty cool. It works for the invasives too. Let's say, what's a good one? Oh, calorie pear. I find Cleveland Select. What's a Cleveland Select? And I just start typing Cleveland and it brings up the profile for calorie pear. If I go in here, common names, it's known by number of trade names, including all those cultivars. The iOS version is searchable, but it's not a freeform search. You can only search by a term in the common name or in the scientific name. The other nice thing is you can search on really broad terms like maple, if I could spell, and it'll bring up every maple in the app. Again, you do have to use the color coding to know which ones to avoid. So Amer maple and Norway maple, please avoid. And then natives, your red and sugar and the hybrid there are native. Then there's a couple exotic, but non-invasive maples too. You can do the same for oaks and other big groups that we have in there. And I think that's it. Yeah. I hope you guys find it useful, especially like if you're doing outreach, to tell people about it and get them excited in using it. And I'm gonna start my video up. And let's see. We do have a few minutes for questions. If you'd like, you can type them into the chat. You also should, oh, okay. You also should have the ability to unmute yourself if you want to just like go rogue and ask a question. There's, I think there's few enough people that can work. You see a question came up already. Is there a plan to make a colorblind friendly option in the app, maybe add some text into the color boxes or the lists? I don't think there is, though. It's something we probably should have figured out, especially our board president is colorblind, so you'd think we would have done that. The one thing, sorry, I'm just looking at, the menus are laid out differently. So like the main menu is all invasives, and it does say at the top, woody invasives, herbaceous invasives. But I agree with like the little tiles. Maybe we should put a letter in there like I, and I don't know what we put for the non-native, or exotic non-natives, E, I guess. But yeah, that's a good point. Have we considered adding suggested removal methods for the invasives? Yeah, we haven't, mostly because sometimes that can get really complex, especially if you're talking about like herbicides. And we just have other resources that do that better. We have our control database, and then the Wiggle website itself for the woodies has just a ton of removal information. So we tried not to be everything to everyone, so we did not include control this time around. Any other questions? Or so I have a couple minutes. I'll mention too, I sort of mentioned it in passing on one of our slides, but we developed a brochure, both with the original app and with the revision. So the original one is out of print now, but the new one, we have a lot of them, and it's kind of a double trifold that kind of folds out into a poster for the woody ones. And it's awesome. I'm really proud of it. And the great part is we have copies. If you're in a Great Lakes state, we can ship them to you for free by the end of the year. That's the end of our grant, so we won't be able to ship them free after that. So if you're interested, it would be great if you check that out on our website, woodyinvasives.org. Adding more herbaceous species like baby's breath. Yeah, I think that would be the obvious next step to do that. To get back to the herbaceous and help that catch up to where we are now with the woodies and aquatic. We don't have immediate plans to do it. I think these things kind of go in cycles. It's what we can get grant funding to do and just where the demand seems to be. So we're going to tackle our field guide, the printed field guide to invasive plants of the Midwest before we do another iteration of landscape alternatives. It does tend to be a little expensive, just because of the time intensivity of doing the profiles, but then we also need to pass some money to UGA to do the programming. So it might be a little while, but in the long run, I'd love to do more herbaceous species. Any other questions? Yes, it's probably coming up on 2. My computer is always a couple minutes off. Yeah, so it's coming up on the hour. Like I said, if anyone thinks of any more questions, let me just share my screen again, put up my slide deck, and go to my contact. You can reach me by phone. This is a voicemail only number at the moment, by try and return voicemails, emails. I'm checking every day. Thank you so much. The other thing you could do that would really help us actually is if you use the app, give it a review, because this is an old app, right? It's from, it's 10 years old, more pretty much. So it would help kind of move it up and give it some exposure if you go in and give it a review via